Welcome to Badger's Podcast. We're your hosts, and today we want to address the topic of people experiencing homelessness and substance abuse. We interviewed 10 UC Berkeley undergraduate students participating in Greek life on Frat Row to learn about their opinions on substance usage as students and their opinions on the substance usage of people experiencing homelessness. We would ask for them to name substances that students used, substances that people experiencing homelessness used, and to think about why these substances they thought of were the same or why they were different. Berkeley is home to the proud Cal Bears, also a place with high rates of homelessness due to the high cost of living. Our goal of this podcast is to take the information we've gathered and to build on it and raise awareness for the truths hidden in the rumors of Berkeley. First, many students use substances for fun or to survive through the cutthroat environment of UC Berkeley. We asked a student what substances college students used, if any, and we received this response.
I think a good majority, at least from my experience, I know like alcohol and also for academic purposes, I know people who abuse or not abuse but maybe use things like Adderall or something. Yeah, I think unfortunately it is pretty accessible for most people to just get any substances, and people don't really take it too seriously. Yeah.
The majority of our interviewees had stated that people experiencing homelessness used more hardcore drugs than students. They would often mention caffeine, weed, or alcohol as substances accessible and used by students. During fraternity parties, it's not uncommon to drink, and many students, despite being underage, do end up consuming alcoholic beverages at these parties. Every morning, and even at late night hours, it's not uncommon to see a student holding a Celsius, yerba mate, Red Bull, or other energy drinks. Especially during finals week or before a huge midterm, many students pull all-nighters with the help of caffeine. In comparison, students would mention meth, cocaine, and alcohol when asked about substances people experiencing homelessness used. These tend to be more hardcore and more addictive than the drugs that were mentioned for college students. However, are students using these substances as well, or is it really just people experiencing homelessness that use these drugs?
I wanted to give some insight on one of the last speakers that we interviewed. In specific, we interviewed a member of a fraternity that was close to Rohan's fraternity on Frat Row. His fraternity has been known in the past for experiencing controversy with sexual assault and other crazy events or dangerous events, which were all fueled by the use of recreational drugs like weed as well as hard drugs like Adderall. Furthermore, one of the biggest issues with the overall perception of homelessness was described when he answered one of these questions. He was asked, "What do you think causes homelessness, and do you think drugs play a role?" And he answered,
I think it's more of just their work ethic or the way their life went. It kind of just went downhill and they fell down a spiral and they kind of just gave up. And they found that dopamine rush. They felt that goodness coming from the drugs, and they kind of just got addicted to it because they couldn't find that in their own life, so they had to find something outside of it.
I feel like this quote is really telling, as it shows the overall misconception of what causes homelessness and how homeless people gravitate towards drugs. For many cases, drugs are not the cause of homelessness. They're something that people who are already homeless must latch onto for their survival and in order to escape the realities of being homeless. Furthermore, I think we need to work more on educating people and correcting their perceptions of how homeless people gravitate towards drugs, and to make it known that homeless people do not depend on drugs. In fact, drugs were never a part of their life. They only became a part of their life as a result of the adversity they faced and the surroundings that they couldn't control.
We asked students how the substances associated with being used by other college students compared to those being used by people experiencing homelessness. Quote,
I guess I think of more like hard substances, I guess. Like, for example, cocaine or meth. Like, those are the ones that I don't think college students use as much. But I think I associate that, or like, I've seen that associated with homelessness. I definitely think it's classism in the sense, like, people see college students as, like, educated and, like, they are usually more well off, especially compared to people who experience homelessness.
when asked, why do you think substance usage between the two groups are different or similar, another student similarly responded, quote,
I think they're different because college students have access to higher end drugs, and homeless people get what they can. And those illegal drugs are more accessible on the streets instead of here on a college campus, because not many people on college campus do hardcore drugs like that. But yeah.
Both responses interestingly focus on the accessibility of drugs for college students and people experiencing homelessness. We see how it's a common sentiment that college students have access to quote-unquote higher-end drugs. Most people associate higher-end drugs with being safer, easier to manage, and not overdose on. On the contrary, people experiencing homelessness are associated with doing hardcore drugs. Hardcore drugs are commonly thought to be more dangerous, addictive, and deadly. It's interesting that the respondents believe that economic and classist factors determine what drugs college students use versus people experiencing homelessness. Classism is defined as discrimination for or against people who are in a certain social class. Here it applies because college students are of a higher socioeconomic status and therefore are perceived as doing quote-unquote better or less dangerous drugs than people experiencing homelessness. Since people experiencing homelessness are of a lower socioeconomic status, people hold stigmatizing beliefs against them, that they do hard drugs. This stigmatizing belief can perhaps be due to classism. This stigmatizing belief against people experiencing homelessness is harmful because it can lead to employment discrimination and other beliefs, such as people experiencing homelessness are undeserving of aid or housing because they are addicts, and it is their own fault. One study from 2008 done in Australia found that 43% of their sample of homeless people had substance abuse problems. They found that heroin, a commonly perceived hard drug, was most commonly used out of this 43%. In addition, only 15% of the population had substance abuse problems before becoming homeless. So although homeless people do use heroin, it is not a majority of the homeless population. And many began using substances after becoming homeless, for various reasons we will elaborate on in our next segments.
A student was asked how the substances people experiencing homelessness used differed from the substances students used, and this was their answer.
I would definitely think of, well, I'm not too sure to be honest, but I would definitely think of some harder drugs. I've seen a lot of people, or just like seen stories that it is a lot harder to get out of homelessness situation if you have like a serious drug addiction, and that can come from like harder substances like cocaine, heroin, that kind of thing.
There's a lot to gain from what this student said. They connected substance usage with education, suggesting that we may glorify student substance usage because students are educated, whereas society often assumes that PH are uneducated. The student also believes that caffeine is the main substance that college students use, which is primarily true, as many drink coffee and energy drinks as a way to stay awake, either to study or to just get their work done. However, the use of caffeine may come in correlation with pH, as they take certain drugs such as Adderall to stay awake as a way of survival, so that they aren't being jumped or their belongings are taken from them. It can also be seen that Adderall is taken as a heightened form of caffeine for both parties. College students like the idea of convenience, so they can quickly opt for caffeine or weed, where a homeless person might have better access or easier access to Adderall and will abuse it more for the sake of safety. This student also thinks that PH just has it harder to get out of this cycle of homelessness when it comes to having an addiction. In an article talking about homelessness and substance abuse by Dr. Guy Johnson and Chris Chamberlain, they think the involvement of the homeless culture is a double-edged sword, and that it can be difficult for people to fully understand what people experiencing homelessness are going through, and that to avoid homelessness, it is best to make it hard for people who are already experiencing homelessness to get out of.
Building off of these themes of survival and a general misinterpretation of the lived experiences of people experiencing homelessness, we must acknowledge that some of our interviewees did have a nuanced understanding of this problem. When we asked students why they think people experiencing homelessness use substances, one student said,
"Oh, I think they use substances because it'd be cold outside, but the drugs give them a nice warm feeling, and an escape from their bleak reality. Maybe forget about their problems for a while. I think that's why."
This quote harkens to an article written by Dr. Guy Johnson and Chris Chamberlain in 2008 that said, "When people are homeless, they adapt in order to survive." Although responses may vary from person to person, using drugs is a common form of adaptation. As has been previously noted, a common coping tool for both students and people experiencing homelessness are substances. Sure, there may be different degrees of accessibility to which drugs each population can access, but what is important to note is that each user is simply acting based on their immediate environment. Everyone is simply trying to function and do what they need in order to complete their responsibilities. What is even more important to note is that the severity of the immediate responsibilities is much higher for people experiencing homelessness than for college students. Trying to stay awake through the night to protect your body and your belongings is a far taller task than staying awake to finish a paper. This claim is not to negate the stress that college students endure, but it is a crucial reality that must be understood so the marginalized population in this scenario, people experiencing homelessness, can face less discrimination from the privileged population, college students. We must exercise empathy to better understand the needs of both groups, our common motivations, and which population deserves more support.
When asked why students use substances, a student replied,
From a perspective of someone who doesn't actively do a lot of drugs, probably a form of escapism, especially at Berkeley when there's a lot of non-talked about mental health issues too. I would say it's a way to get away from the social pressures and academic pressures at Berkeley.
We were able to find others with different perspectives on why substance abuse is used amongst people experiencing homelessness and connecting it back to student usage. Students who may not have any experience with consuming drugs or haven't done many are asked about the common reasons why one may use substances. Through a student's perspective on why students may use substances are very similar as to why people experiencing homelessness might use it for themselves. It is a way of escapism. Many individuals who have no other option but to turn to the streets often find themselves comfort in drugs. Most tend to lack family and friend support. If those experiencing homelessness find a way to stop their substance abuse, lack of support from those close to them will inevitably make it difficult to remain clean. For most of people experiencing homelessness, survival is their top priority over drug counseling or rehabilitation. Food and shelter is often their worry, meanwhile substances may help one conciliate. According to a study conducted by Johnson and Chamberlain in 2008, Homelessness and Substance Abuse, which comes first, they discovered that a third of the sample size have already abused substances before becoming homeless, while the other 2/3 developed these problems after becoming homeless. A quote I found in this same study that overall explains the usage of substances gives credit to Neal's 2001 study. It says, "Some people take drugs as a way to cope with or escape the harsh, oppressive environment that confronts them."
An interviewee stated,
I think there's a misconception about substance abuse where most of the time the individual is blamed for it rather than again like the circumstances around it or like in their own environment for that to happen. I mean, like I just said, like sometimes there's like a lack of support for someone who might be experiencing issues with substance abuse.
This response demonstrates a great deal of consideration towards the nuances surrounding the issues of homelessness and substance abuse. It's easy to pass the accountability for homelessness or drug use onto the individual by criticizing a perceived aspect of their character rather than the larger structural forces at play. This is because it's often much easier to grasp a direct causal relationship rather than something complex and multifaceted. Extensive research has been conducted to determine whether substance abuse has a precursory or successive effect on homelessness. In the article Homeless and Substance Abuse, which comes first, Dr. Guy Johnson and Chris Chamberlain reinforced the well-documented conclusion that problematic drug use often arises among PEH as they become more involved in the homeless community because drug and substance use is a common practice in the homeless subculture, to the point where it's almost considered a rite of passage or initiation into the community. This phenomenon bears striking resemblance to the hazing and initiation rituals associated with college fraternities and sororities. Furthermore, 2/3 of the PEH sampling population in their study reported having substance abuse issues, with a further 43% stating that they developed said issues after becoming homeless. This confirms the prevailing finding that in many cases, substance abuse succeeds homelessness.
All right, so thank you all for joining us on this enlightening journey through the complexities of substance use stigma among people experiencing homelessness. It's really been a thought-provoking exploration challenging our preconceptions and shedding light on the inherent biases ingrained in our society. So as we conclude, I just want to leave you guys with a call to action. So we want you to consider the power of perspective. Before passing judgment, think twice before consuming your next substance. Reflect on the narratives we've shared today and recognize that individuals experiencing homelessness may not be choosing to abuse them, but rather are facing a myriad of challenges beyond their control. So as we wrap up, I'd like to emphasize the importance of reaching out and making a difference in our community. If this podcast has sparked a desire within you to contribute positively, consider volunteering your time and resources. There's a lot of places in the Bay Area, especially within UC Berkeley itself, that sort of provides essential support for those students in need, and those in need in general. So there's places like the Basic Needs Center, the Suitcase Clinic, etc. And volunteering at these kind of places gives you an opportunity to make a meaningful impact and to really foster a better understanding and empathy. So it's a chance to step outside of our comfort zones and actively contribute to building a more compassionate community. Throughout this project, we've navigated through some biases and challenges, as we talked about, and confronted some contradictions and really strived to unravel the layers of stigma surrounding substance use and homelessness. We've learned that addressing these issues requires a collective effort, a willingness to listen, and mostly a commitment to dismantling these stereotypes. So as we part ways, let's carry the lessons into our daily lives. Let's change our assumptions, engage in open conversation, and foster a community that values inclusivity and understanding. Together, we can really contribute to a paradigm shift in how we perceive and interact with people experiencing homelessness. So thank you guys for being a part of this journey, and remember that the power to make a positive change lies within each of us. So until next time, stay compassionate, stay curious, and continue to seek understanding in all walks of life. Goodbye for now.